Hello, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. I'm sure we have our usual cohort of people from Connecticut, but yeah, let us know uh, where you are watching us from. Wondering if we have any people from Florida. Um, um, yeah, the numbers are slowly ticking up. Um, or even if you don't want to tell us where you're tuning in from, what brought you here um, this evening. This this place we're going to talk about this evening is a very well-known place, um, but perhaps its history is not as well known. So we'll hear more about that in a couple of minutes. And I'll just get started with my introduction. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the literary program coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And I'm so grateful to have you here for this virtual program for American Castle, 100 Years of Mar-a-Lago. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please, if you are not a member, please consider becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. Please visit our website for more information. And now on to our guests. Our author is Mary Shanklin. And she teaches journalism at the University of Central Florida. Her work has been published in USA Today, Architectural Record, Urban Land Institute, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, and Orlando Sentinel. She has been recognized with awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, Gerald R. Loeb Awards, Investigative Reporters and Editors, Society of Black Journalists, Pulitzer, which is a team entry, and many more. Our moderator is Bill Schaefer. He is the author of The Scandalous Hamiltons, A Gilded Age Grifter, a Founding Father's Disgraced Descendant, and a Trial at the Dawn of Tabloid Journalism, which we did a program for last July, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel. He's also the author of Beranger Motion Displays, 55 Moving Scenes of Love, Courtship, and Surrender. Schaefer has also been published on designobserver.com and Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum online. He holds an MA History of Design and Curatorial Studies from Parsons, the New School. During this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, please post that directly into our Q&A section that is on the bottom left of the screen. And I will be dropping a link to purchase the book in the chat. So please do us a favor and purchase the book. Please sit back and enjoy. I'll turn this over to Mary and Bill.
Thanks very much, Omar. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to say before we get started, I really appreciate, I think all authors do, the Mark Twain House, your ongoing continued support for authors and our books. We work for years researching and writing them, and it's great to have such an enthusiastic institution supporting us. So thank you for all of that. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Mary to talk about Mar-a-Lago. I can't think of a private residence in the U.S. that is mentioned more frequently than Mar-a-Lago, and there's lots to talk about, lots of details in this book. Before we get to that, though, Mary, I was wondering if you could tell us all a little bit about how your interest in Mar-a-Lago started, and when or how did that interest go from a sort of general curiosity to, I think I'll write a book about this.
Jumping into the dark hole that is bottomless. That
right.
I was so thankful that my husband never asked me how much I was getting paid by the hour to do all this. As you know so well, all the years of research that go into this that start in the most innocuous way. Of course, in Florida, where I am, Mar-a-Lago is, even 5 years ago, it was certainly a household name within Florida. And then I've really liked to do investigations on real estate dealings. So it really, kind of had my attention a little bit. A lot of good work was being done journalistically on what was happening there. And then I came across a forum. It was a National Park Service forum, and in there somebody mentioned this out of print book. There's another shout out to the authors, an out of print book that talked about how Mar-a-Lago became part of the National Park Service, and then the failings that happened where the National Park Service then lost that. And I would see reports in the press about, every once in a while, rarely would somebody mention the history of that. And when they did, a lot of times they would say, it was because it was too expensive to upkeep. And so I just started digging deeper, and you just get addicted to all the doors that open.
Of course, of course. So before we get to the house itself, I was wondering if you could give us all a little background about Palm Beach. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was still relatively not desolate, but it wasn't what it became. How did it go from the turn of the 20th century to the time we get from into the 1920s and 30s, this sort of playground for winter homes of enormously wealthy and powerful people? How did Palm Beach kind of become Palm Beach, if as it were?
Yeah, probably the primary thing that distinguished Palm Beach from all the other little winter towns along the coast of Florida was Henry Flagler had built this railroad, and then he also built a house in Palm Beach, and his money, started. Wealth attracts wealth,
Sure.
and so then you started getting gambling houses in there, and it still was a very innocent place,
Right.
but it became what the people who would winter down there would call the colony. The colony coming down for the winter, but Henry Flagler was pivotal in distinguishing Palm Beach.
Right. And so when we talk about wealth attracting wealth, we have to talk about the woman behind Mar-a-Lago and her immense wealth. She is a story unto herself, house or no house. But tell us a little bit about Marjorie Merriweather Post.
Oh yeah, it's so interesting, Phil. I think that if we've ever, as children, ate post cereal products,
right.
We somehow probably contributed to the maintenance and just the livelihood of
Some new shrubbery around the driveway and more.
Exactly right. So Marjorie Merriweather Post was the only child of C.W. Post, the founder of Post Cereals. And it wasn't like he inherited this wealth. He was almost disabled in a way. And he would put together granolas and sorghums and put out this breakfast cereal where he differentiated himself from all the other people who were trying to do that. Was that he understood, he came to realize that with advertising and marketing, that he could really propel his brand.
Right.
And so that's the basis of where that money came from.
Right. So she grew up in an enormous amount of wealth. By the time we get to Mar-a-Lago, she was an incredibly wealthy woman.
Oh, yeah, incredibly wealthy and, pretty well traveled, well studied. She ended up, first she married Edward Close. He was an attorney from Connecticut,
Right.
and that was the first of her four husbands. So her father had died, but her first husband, even though he didn't last that long, each of her four husbands probably lasted on average maybe 10 or 15 years. But he helped her get the estate where her stepmother, might have gotten more of that. And so he helped her in a way to get the money that, she was able to go on and build something like that.
Right. And it was her second husband, though, that joined her in the development of Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, her second husband, who is perhaps even as well known or in some circles better known than Post serials, is E.F. Hutton. I don't know if
Right.
you recall, like in the 1970s, when there was that
Of
slogan,
course.
when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen.
Right.
When he was speaking to her on the heels of her divorce with C.W. Post, she was listening. And it was a very short courtship. They got married, and when they did, they did not start out building Mar-a-Lago. They built a golf villa in near the Everglades Club in Palm Beach. And from that, though, you can't really entertain. You can't, really be at the top of the social circles, when you've got this, little two-story villa.
Right.
So they had their eyes for something larger.
Mm-hmm. And it's when Mar-a-Lago was being built, there was an enormous amount of building going on, houses of the same size, some of them even bigger, maybe, or that there was this sort of rush to it reminds me of sort of in the Gilded Age when people were building, cottages in Newport or mansions along Fifth Avenue. There was this sort of one-upsmanship that would go along, that everybody would go to somebody's house, see what they've done, and then want to do sort of plus one, to kind of outdo each other in a way.
Right, right. Yeah, your social standing really depended on your displays of wealth. And
Right.
so you're right that Mar-a-Lago was a fraction of the size of one in particular was the Stotesbury estate.
Mm-hmm.
It was on the north side of the Isle of Palm Beach. And that was more than double the size. It had an aviary. It had, I think, a 40 car garage. It was enormous, and that was the social event of the year, to go to the Stotesbury birthday party every year.
Right. And the architect and the it's Wyeth, I believe, correct? Right.
Yes.
He was building a lot of these homes there, and the interiors of Mar-a-Lago were done by a guy named Joseph Urban, who had a penchant for flourishes and ornaments. So there's a lot of sort of over the topness about the, not even so much the exterior of the house, but in the interiors. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, they were such polar opposites. The architect and Joseph Urban, who was more of the interior designer,
Right.
and he had done things. His resume included things like the Ziegfeld Follies. He
Right.
very theatrical, and at the end of the day, the architect White ended up really kind of disavowing his work there a little bit, because I think there was the feeling on his part that it didn't really, represent the architectural standards. They both were very serious architects. They had really good pedigrees, but
Right.
just, where one was really wanted to entertain you, and the other one wanted to impress you.
Right. Right. So the house is built. and Hutton and Marjorie are in residence during the season. But when it struck me that during the 30s, during the Depression and I guess upheaval in their relationship, the house was sat unoccupied for sort of several years. There were no sort of lavish parties and entertainments being done. They all of this money and time went into building it, and then it kind of wasn't used for a while.
Right. And as I'm sure you and a lot of the listeners know, when you're at that level of wealth, you don't just have one second residence.
Sure.
There were competing residents. And near the end of the E.F. Hutton, Marjorie Merriweather Post marriage, maybe 3 years from the end of it, she gave him like the ultimate gift. It was a yacht by the name of the Hussar, and
Right.
it was the largest. I think it was a four-mast of its kind, I think, in the world. So when you have that and you can go see all of these ports of entries, really go see the world.
Right.
It's hard for a place like Mar-a-Lago to compete. They also had what was then called Camp Huttridge, later became Camp Topridge, that has also been in the news in the last year as one of the places that the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas visited, that he would vacation there. There was also another house, a hunting lodge on outside of New York, an hour or so away. So Mar-a-Lago had a lot of competition.
Right. Right. And you know what struck me as I was reading through the book is that all of these houses that were built during this kind of heyday, right, in the 20s and the 30s, when Palm Beach just kind of becomes Palm Beach.
Yeah.
Many of those houses didn't last for a very long time. 20, 30 years. By the 50s into the 1960s, they're starting to either be razed or broken up, subdivided, et cetera, et cetera. And yet Mar-a-Lago persisted as its own standalone entity, and wasn't affected by all of that. But it really strikes me that for all of the money spent, and again time on all of these incredibly grand homes, they start coming down after not too long of a time.
Right. And in addition to the homes, the collections within those homes, where the owners brought in artwork and ceramics and carvings and really kind of riches from around the world. And it's with the El Mirasol that we mentioned a few minutes ago, that ended up just being auctioned off. And
Right.
like really what happened on Palm Beach, these grand places that stretched from the intercoastal waterway, which was called Lake Worth, to the Atlantic, a couple acres at least across. They were all raised because the price of the property became so valuable. And in Florida, developers often have, and particularly at that time, more sway than they might in other places. And so
Right.
that was all subdivided into much smaller places, which was Mar-a-Lago was teetering on the edge at
Mhm.
times of having that
Right.
happen.
And so what was it about Mar-a-Lago, I guess, was it Marjorie Merriweather Post that enabled it to say sort of true to its original home and not be either auctioned off or subdivided into different properties? There's not many of those houses that survived, if that's the right word, as Mar-a-Lago did. What was the why was that?
Well, You know, throughout the years, every once in a while, you would see interest raise in her selling the property, and I don't think she could ever really get to that point. And then her children were not interested in taking it on. You know, it just didn't define, you know, their standards. It wasn't, you know, they didn't want to necessarily, you know, spend all their time in Palm Beach. But for Marjorie Merriweather Post, that was her vision. Mar-a-Lago was her vision. It
Right.
was her money. It was honestly, Bill, it was the thing that stayed true in her life throughout all these marriages, throughout all the decades. Things came, things went. But Mar-a-Lago, you know,
Yeah,
she
it's an
just
interesting point.
yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, and rather than selling it, her and her estate, her children, they tried any number of means to turn, or had any number of ideas for Mar-a-Lago to go from a private residence to an institutional or educational facility. There's a number of them in the book. Can you shed some light on what were some of the things that Mar-a-Lago might have become?
Yes. So this was a very interesting turn. When Marjorie Merriweather Post was probably turning around 70, she was able to get the state of Florida interested in taking on Mar-a-Lago. And at that time, they had a group in the state of Florida called the Council of 100. And on the Council of 100, there was still people like Walter Cronkite, big name people on this. And one of the things that they were looking at doing was taking Mar-a-Lago and turning it into something. They were going to call it the Mar-a-Lago Center for Advanced Scholars. And they wanted it to basically be what we think of as a think tank. There was another one where it would have been the Marjorie Merriweather Post Center for Arts and Culture. You know, the ballet was going to lease space there. They had any number of these ideas come to pass. She still wanted to keep title of it until she passed. And the state of Florida was always interested, but there was always something in the background that was working against Mar-a-Lago. More than disinterested heirs, you know, more than the hurricanes, probably more than the developers even. There was the leadership in Palm Beach at the time. They didn't want Mar-a-Lago to become a public place. You know, they built their whole identity on exclusivity, and so, you know, to have this place where, you know, members of the public could come and go, and, you know, traffic might go up, and you know, it just wasn't how they define their island.
Right. And her wealthy and politically connected neighbors weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of the masses, so to speak, kind of coming in and out of their very tidy little enclave. So there was some resistance there as well.
Right. We saw, so then at one point then, the state of Florida, after being lobbied by the leadership of Palm Beach, the governor, the Council of 100, they backed away from this idea. And then in came Lady Bird Johnson.
Right. I wanted a very important visitor.
Pivotal. That was an incredible visit by her. I just have to bear with me. I just have like this little sentence or two of her impression the first time when she first laid eyes on Mar-a-Lago. Okay, this is Lady Bird Johnson, and this is from the Lady Bird Johnson diaries and her transcripts, and you can even listen to her readings. So she said, this is how she described it. There was indirect lighting, Lady Bird Johnson recalled, and I could see the palms soaring skyward. And there was Mrs. Post at the door, calm and regal, the last of the queens in a setting that will probably not continue or be duplicated in this country in the lifetime of my children.
Oh, yeah,
And,
that's great. How
yeah.
did that visit? How did that visit come about? And what was the? Uh, she wasn't invited there just purely for social reasons, right? She was.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a mission behind it all.
Right. I was hoping to get the campaign donations from that era, but I was unsuccessful. But one would have to guess that there was some patronage going on.
Right.
I think in Washington D.C. circles where Marjorie Merriweather had a post, I had a house, that they knew each other from that area. Two powerful women in their own rights.
Right.
And it's a storied visit. It's we've got in there like the food that was served at the dinner and the tour, the music that was played there, and it really was almost like Marjorie Merriweather Post courting Lady Bird Johnson, and there Mar-a-Lago was kind of like the ring, and the other thing that Lady Bird Johnson, was a little bit disappointed was at that point in her life that Marjorie Merriweather Post was kind of hard of hearing, but really Mar-a-Lago kind of did the talking, and she came back, and before we knew it, then it was headed into. I'm sure that she bent the ear of LBJ and his cabinet, and it was very quickly then that got into the Department of Interior, and then had a life as a decade in the National Park Service, which that was the most stunning thing to me.
Yeah, I had no idea about that. When you think of national parks, you think of the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and all of that kind of stuff, but Mar-a-Lago was under the auspices of the National Park Service for a number of years, a decade, I guess, which is an interesting sort of turn in its history.
Yeah, that was the thing that interested me most, is how this house that, as you said at the beginning, this is probably going to be the residence that we hear about more than any other residence in the next 12 months. And just the realization that belonged to us at one time. That was federal property. Yeah. And how that happened, and then how that there's not a lot of properties that were in the National Park Service that have ever suffered the rare humiliation of being divested. But Mar-a-Lago was one of them.
Right. And I guess that that kind of gets us up to the current occupant of Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump, and how the house went from the National Park Service through a couple of other iterations of what could this be, to coming up for sale and being purchased by Donald Trump. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, it was so fascinating. At the end of its time in the National Park Service, there was this like really interesting visit from Richard Nixon. And he was with, I don't know if you recall, B.B. Rebozo.
Yes, sure.
He brought B.B. Rebozo. He'd done a trip to South Florida, and there was Air Force One, the helicopter, bringing him and B.B. Rebozo up to check out Mar-a-Lago. I'm sure it was like really a stunning thing to see this huge, beautiful place that was just shuttered off, and it was supposed to be like enriching the lives of Americans, and instead just kind of mocking it. But then within a month of that, Nixon resigned, and then it got like a little bit complex. How we talked about the other properties that were competing, the other constellation, the other stars in the Marjorie Merriweather Post. So one of them, the one in Washington, D.C., Hillwood, the Smithsonian Institution had agreed to take it. Marjorie Merriweather Post died with the understanding that the Smithsonian was taking Hillwood, and that the National Park Service was forever going to take care of Mar-a-Lago. And of course, that didn't happen. The Smithsonian then backed off it. They ended up having different interests and, kind of showing off the jewels and, how that particular lifestyle. But then the trust, the Marjorie Merriweather Post Trust, they needed some cash to make Hillwood a private museum when the Smithsonian wouldn't take it. And so basically they had to take back Mar-a-Lago. The people in Palm Beach, didn't want it as a national park anyway.
Right.
And then, they had to put it on the market, and it sat there. And I think the initial price was around 20 million. And they had like a couple of prospective buyers come along. Remember how the people of Palm Beach, they didn't want this like intrusive presence. They didn't want, the traffic and the boorish public, coming into their island. So then the people who there were two prospective buying groups. One of them, it was a group of guys. They were like big fans of country music. They would have like these bashes with 600 people. They had like this big boat that they named the Outrageous. They were just, I'm sure that the people in Palm Beach that they're
not exactly Palm Beach
shuddering.
Right.
Yeah, and then there was another one who, the bottom line was they all had their eyes on the land, and they all wanted to subdivide, and so then along comes and the town was not going along with that. On the second buyer, the town did start to say, we got to do something with this. All these other estates have been subdivided. How can we not do that in this case? So then along came Donald Trump, Donald and Ivana.
Right.
And the story goes that they were in Palm Beach for something, and Donald Trump, as I'm sure that we could all imagine, telling the chauffeur, well, take me to, like the best place for sale on the island, the most impressive place. And so he took them there. And then, really, there's conflicting stories about how many offers that he made, but he got it for a deal. And yeah, what's often not reported that when he got it, he didn't get the beachfront part of that, and so then he had to like pony up a little bit more money to get the beachfront part. But then so then Donald and Ivana came in and were able to kind of enter Palm Beach society somewhat with the mantle of Marjorie Merriweather Post.
Right. And it struck me that I again, something else I didn't know, that part of his purchase agreement is that he would host something called Mar-a-Lago Day, where one day of the year the public would be able to just stream through and take a look around.
Yes, it's an easement, a historic easement that he signed. And he was over leveraged when he bought this, and his creditors came calling. He had to sell off assets. He owned a New Jersey football team, casinos, like a big, I think he owned an actually like a aviation company. And so, but he was saying he was not going to sell Mar-a-Lago. So first he proposed subdividing it. The town said no. And then an attorney of his came up with the idea you could do a club here. And, he brought in people, he opened it up to people who were not going or not invited to the other clubs in Palm Beach, minorities, Jewish people. So he did open that up.
Mm-hmm. So I know that we're going to kind of move to questions here in a few minutes, and I saw a question pop up in the chat if you were going to show any photographs, and I know that you have some queued up. So before we run out of time, we can keep speaking while you are showing it. But if you want to get your images up on the screen, I'm sure that after all of this discussion about this place, folks would love to kind of fix in their mind, if they haven't seen enough pictures of Mar-a-Lago yet, what the place looked like. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a little screen sharing, and you can go from there.
All right. Yeah. The pictures are so great. And it's one thing to tell a
Yeah.
story, but certainly the pictures are what everybody wants to see. And I can kind of go through this. Hopefully somewhat quick. Kind of keep me on my time here, Bill, because I can pause. Okay,
all right. I'll be on it.
So there's the big overview. This is what it looks like today. If you can see my cursor here, this was all added during the Trump administration. It's a huge ballroom. Back over here to the left, this was more kind of like the garage, kind of like, the working part of the estate. It's now a salon. And there's guest suites throughout, little golf. There's like a little helicopter landing pad. Marjorie Merriweather Post, she used to hit golf balls out in the front. And there, of course, is the beach, the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. Okay, here's what it looked like to begin with. Like this part that's all green.
Right.
And here's the overview today, all cut up. When Marjorie Merriweather Post first started going there, this was their entertainment on the jungle trail, being carted around there. And there she was about the time of when she met E.F. Hutton, looking as regal as ever. Her 4 husbands, 3 of whom were a factor in Mar-a-Lago and what it would become. Here's our warring architects. Right. Miriam Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban, and I'm going to get back to them in just a second. Like a historical photo of it. Here's the grand entrance. We see heads of state come here. This is really the entry hall. These beautiful Spanish lanterns. Really, when you go into Mar-a-Lago, your eyes are riveted everywhere. There's something to look at in every inch, every ceiling, everywhere. It's not like today's taste where everything's clean and industrial and smooth. It's just very ornate. And
Urban really saw this interior as theater in a way, right? That it was a place to see a show, so to speak.
Right. So when it came out, here was like some of the early reviews. In the Palm Beach Post, it said that it would be one of the most pretentious dwellings in Palm Beach. That's saying a lot. And then the Miami Herald came out and said, actually, Pat Ballou, she was liking one of my posts on Twitter today. Mar-a-Lago's freewheeling architectural style leaps from the most garish periods of Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Moorish, French, Portuguese architecture to one of the most severe periods, on and on. Reminds her of an impressionable tourist who, having made her way doggedly through Europe's cathedrals and castles, wants to display all the, is that gewgaws, she'd collected on one shelf. Which, I mean, I do have to say, if you've ever gone to like the great castles in Europe and St. Petersburg, you do see rooms, that are, there's the Dutch room, there's the Italian, so it wasn't, alone in that. But here, Bill, is what you're talking about. When we mentioned earlier, this is what Miriam Sims Wyeth said about Joseph Urban and Mar-a-Lago after he was the architect on it. It wasn't my taste. It's the last of Joe Urban. I don't want anyone to think I was the architect in charge. So
that's a pretty bold statement to make when
it was born, between 2 kind of warring factions. So here they are. Here is in the center court, E.F. Hutton with Marjorie Merriweather Post, and this is how they partied. And this was a time when you did flaunt your wealth.
Right.
Oh, and then this is the Hussar. This is their this is storied to be what their house was in Manhattan, kind of by where the Guggenheim is. And
Right.
so a developer came along and he said, I'll tear down your house. I'll buy it from you. And I'll let you have the top 3 floors. And so I don't know if you can see the bottom photograph, but it's still there. And that's the
Right.
view they had of Central Park.
Yeah.
And there is Top Ridge, where Clarence Thomas was visiting in recent years. Here's El Mirasol with the 40 acres, the belle of the ball. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, here it is. Where there's the big auction sign, like out in the front of El Mirasol, and what the Stotesbury had collected. It was so amazing. Even with a $2 admission back in 47, they had 4,000 people who came.
Right.
Items going for almost 10 times their value. Here's what you were talking about, Bill, with the dark years, where it was shuttered down, and this was really often during her marriage to Joseph Davies, who was a U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. And during that time, it was a little bit controversial that they had collected a lot of artifacts that were really taken during the Stalin regime to fund that. And there's the Florida. There's Lady Bird Johnson.
There's the famous meeting. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, that was the turning point.
Right.
Or could have been the turning point. And there is the story of how it was divested is such an incredible thing. And they had plans. They looked at the admission prices for the San Simeon, looked at prices for the Biltmore, and they kind of modeled it after that.
Right.
And they were only going to have like a handful of shuttle vans come from the mainland over there. So it really wasn't going to be that intrusive, but the book goes into more detail. So Mar-a-Lago's, the reason that the federal government and that we no longer have a stake in Mar-a-Lago is because of a battle between these two. The one on the right is a Florida congressman from Palm Beach, Dan Mica. And so, he wanted to get Mar-a-Lago out of the National Park Service. Here's his quote.
And why so? Why did he want to?
Because he was getting lobbied. His like real patronage, the leadership of Palm Beach, they didn't want that. They didn't want a public park in their midst. So he was doing their bidding.
Gotcha.
So his great quote is, "I'm a mainstream Floridian, but I can set a 3-alarm blaze too." Yeah. So he's going up against the gentleman on the right, is from California, Phil Burton. And here's the quote on Phil Burton. I got like this. He was
He's quite a colorful character in the book, I have to say.
Oh my gosh. Here's the great quote for Phil Burton. "Undoubtedly the most abrasive, tempestuous, uncouth, vulgar, dictatorial, obnoxious, boorish, and ill-mannered politician who ever appeared on the political scene." And that was in his biography. Other people said that he was, one of the most brilliant and genius politicians that they'd ever met. But in the end, the battle of what happened on the House floor was so epic. I just have to read this one tiny little sentence from the book where I got to interview Dan Mica. A lot of the people were no longer, had died, and I wasn't able, but I did get Dan Mica. He said, and he described what happened on the House floor as they were taking on this, the Mar-a-Lago issue. Okay, so Dan Mica says, "I'm sitting there and I can't believe this. He sees me sitting there." That would be Dan Burton. and walks over and stands in front of me. He starts growling and he grabs me by the lapels. He picks me up and he says, "I will get you, Micah. I will get you." It was like, it was a real battle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Let me see if I can kind of keep going a little bit more. I don't know if I have any
I am
more.
going to give you the 2-minute warning, Mary, before we get to questions. So
Yeah.
just anything that you think would be interesting for the folks to see, bravo,
Yeah.
and then we'll be turning it back to Omar here soon.
Yeah, my Trump era photos I don't really have on this. It's kind of, I was sticking with like a little bit more of the historic, but I can tell you, during the Trump administration, of course, just as Marjorie Merriweather Post had three husbands, who came and went in Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump has had three wives who've come and, certainly Melania is still there, but, it has been like a little bit of a revolving door of ex-spouses there. And I think it's also been like a pretty welcoming door for them to come back, for them to have celebrations there, for them to be kind of part of like the larger family that became Mar-a-Lago.
Do you know how many members there are of Mar-a-Lago now? How many members? Is there a limit on the number of members that he can admit to the club by?
Oh, there is. Yeah. When the town first approved the club, it was pretty controversial that the Bath and Tennis Club was right next to it. And, a lot of times that affects the zoning that's next to you. But the town prescribed limits on club membership. They prescribed limits on traffic. And, that all kind of went away. It wasn't, really honored.
Has that been adhered to at all, or is it?
No, it's just like the easement that you brought up, that Donald Trump did sign an easement with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, allowing for one day a very limited number, just 10 people, but it's people who would otherwise not be allowed to go there. And I went to the trust and I said, well, where's the evidence that you've allowed this to happen? And I think that their feeling was, given the revolving door of Mar-a-Lago, that in spirit it happens, but I think that probably would be just a matter of opinion.
In spirit, it might have happened, but in actuality, maybe not.
Yeah.
So, well, I don't have any more questions. I think to anybody who's tuned in, I've read the book. It's impeccably researched. Everything that Mary talks about in there is sourced and backed up. So as a nonfiction author, that always impresses me, that when something has been really thoroughly put together, and it's a great read. It's you hear this name Mar-a-Lago just sort of floating in the ether on a daily basis, and to learn about the various stages of its life and what it was, what it could have been, it's really fascinating. So I'd encourage everybody to pick it up and give it a read. It's really an interesting book. So thank you, Mary, for spending some time with me. Omar, if you are still there, I am going to cede the airwaves to you. And I'm sure Mary is happy to answer some questions before we all sign off. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the recognition from another nonfiction, a student of nonfiction.
Yeah, thanks. Omar?
while
maybe you should maybe you have to leave your screen, Mary. I'm not
oh,
sure.
probably let's stop our share.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh.
While we're waiting on Omar to pop up, I can talk a little bit about the name Mar-a-Lago, where that came
from. I meant to ask you that so that everybody knows officially what that means. Most people probably do, but for those who don't.
Okay, so we talked about how Marjorie Merriweather Post and E.F. Hutton had a place over on the golf course, and she decided she needed a presence on the Atlantic. And at that time, on the south side of the island, the story goes that she went with her real estate agent, crawling through the jungle, crawling through the undergrowth, and basically, it's this property that's on a coral reef, built on a coral reef. And it is the property goes from the sea to the lake, which that is Mar-a-Lago. That's where that comes from.
Yeah.
I don't know if Omar's in there. Is there another question?
I'm not sure. Maybe I'll look in the chat and see if there's maybe this is Omar coming. Here's
I can't clear the table without.
Hi. I don't see any other questions here. Let's see. Well, there's a question in the chat. Did you all see that about the restriction on residency by the owner?
Yeah, I didn't see that, but that came up when Donald Trump basically decided that he wasn't going to be a resident of New York anymore, and then declared Florida as his full-time residence. But in determining the club rules for Mar-a-Lago, it was never seen as a permanent residence. So that was kind of another issue, of the Trump ownership era of Mar-a-Lago, really kind of redefining the rules a little bit. I did have the privilege of going there on an assignment at one time, and another thing that became like a pretty big battle of the Trump ownership era was, and you really couldn't stand out on the veranda and have a conversation because of the plane noise that would go overhead. And Donald Trump, he was suing the airport authority and the executive director of it. And I think at one time he had a flag that he was trying to fly. It was like 50 feet in the air or something, just to, kind of, his sign to Palm Beach that, he was kind of at war with the, with the airport and the airport noise. Ultimately, Palm Beach, while they didn't get, the, 500 or 600 people at the country music festivals that, from, what they did get though, it was anything but, a quiet place during the Trump presidency, and, people taking to the streets and marching, and, the big balloons of baby Donald, and, the billboards, and, it was, it was no longer a quiet place, and the helicopters and the Coast Guard and the, well then, of course, then it became famous again, even after the presidency, when, the FBI came. And so it is an address that just never seems to surrender the headlines.
And in fact, those headlines are continuing now with his I'm in New York, with his trial in New York, and over one question is the valuation of Mar-a-Lago, and what he says the judge put the value at. The judge says, no, I'm taking it from the Palm Beach tax assessor's office. Is it from somebody who is there from the sort of Palm Beach perspective? Are there any opinions or
Well,
about
I tell you, certainly Palm Beach property is very valuable, and on a piece on an unencumbered 17-acre parcel that would stretch from Mar-a-Lago, from the lake to the sea. You could probably get I'm not even going to put a number on it, but the issue here is that it is encumbered, and it has that easement from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, not just about the Mar-a-Lago Day, but it's very controlled about what can be added there. The Trump administration wanted to do, like extend a dining room. They could only get permission to do kind of almost like a semi-permanent. It's almost like you see photos at the front, it almost looks like a tent. And Donald Trump knew before he signed this that it was going to, kill the market value on Mar-a-Lago. And he actually said something to the effect of, I'm not signing that yet. I'm not stupid. But ultimately that was the only way that he could get his club.
Interesting. So, well, that is it for me this evening, Mary. I'm again, I'm thankful to spend the time, and I'll encourage everybody one last time, go out and buy the book. It will be worth it. I can promise you that. So,
yeah. A pleasure. Thank you so much. And to the Mark Twain Museum and House, thanks for this program.
Yes, it was great to have you, Mary, and thank you so much, Bill.
Sure.
It was a great conversation.
Great.
Please buy Mary's book, and thank you for attending. Have a great evening.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.